Sonic had a rough transition. I hope she's doing okay. In the mid to late 90s, most video games were in this weird transition. See, in the early 90s, most games had you moving from left to right. This is known as 2D. But most saw what was coming next, like the next logical step. The third D. Nintendo would dilly-dally with this 3D shit back at the Super Nintendo with games like F-Zero, Star Fox, Super Mario Kart. They were primitive and impressive for their time, but one console generation later, they'd be completely swept by the power of those later consoles. Sega came out with the Sega Saturn, whatever the fuck that is, and Sony set their foot in the console race with the Sony fucking PlayStation. But Nintendo, you know, late to the party as per usual, created the most revolutionary console to ever grace the scene. The Nintendo 64. The PS1 and Saturn were 32-bit, but that Nintendo 64, it was the true 64-bit gaming that we all yearned for. It sold significantly worse than the PlayStation 1. See, even with more power hardware-wise, Nintendo opted to keep using cartridges instead of switching over to CDs. They hated optical media before it was cool to hate optical media. But a cartridge can't hold as much data as a PS1 discs, and CDs were way easier to develop for, which left Nintendo with third-party scraps. But the N64 had one game. One game that would change video games forever. Still considered one of the greatest video games of all time, Super Mario 64. This game was revolutionary. 3D platformers existed before then, but none as pristine and quality as Mario 64 was. They could never get the controls right for these games till Nintendo brought out the peakest of controls, which left people looking at Sega for that 3D game to compete with Mario. The Saturn had little to no sight of Sonic at all. So what did Sega do? What Sega does best, fuck up! The Saturn was going to get that 3D Sonic with Sonic Extreme, but when development was too extreme for the devs to handle, bye-bye. There were other attempts at 3D Sonic, but the closest Sonic got to a true 3D game was Sonic 3D Blast. But Sega then released Sonic Jam, a collection of the first 3 Sonic games, and included was a 3D hub where you controlled Sonic. This ended up being the technical showcase to the Sonic game people begged for on the Saturn. Sonic Adventure was a big fucking deal. It changed so much for the franchise and for gaming as a whole. Sega put their all into this game and the Dreamcast release. On 9/9/99, Sega dropped the biggest game to ever grace the world at that time. But did it compare to Mario 64? And do both games still hold up today? Well, that's what I'm here for. Also, rants due this week. Mario 64 is often lauded as the greatest video game ever made. Better than Mario USA? To this day, Mario 64 holds up a lot in many people's eyes. What the fuck? It has signs of age, but it somehow stood the test of time for most people. But is Mario 64 as good as the public perceives it? I mean, I guess. Super Mario 64 is one of those games that if you called bad, you need to be sentenced to death. Like, it started a revolution. Most of the shit you play nowadays, think this motherfucker. 64 is still a great time even nowadays. I'm a little harsh on it because I can't let those two fucks in Nintendo Network tell me it's the best Mario game. Firstly, let's talk about the cons because bitches hate it when I'm cynical. Waiter, you put too much cynicism in my video. The camera controls. They were ahead of the curve. They can also bite the curve. Most 3D platformers before this had what the industry calls tank controls. Tank controls is very simple. It's when the character controls like a fucking tank. Forward moves the tank forward, and while left and right change the direction the character's moving. This was because before the 64 was even released, the PS1 and Saturn controllers only featured D-pads. But when 64 hit the scene and introduced the joystick for the first time ever since the weird keypad controller era, they designed Mario's controls right around this. Moving the joystick in a circle moves Mario in a circle. But also introduced was the C buttons, later becoming the C stick. C stands for camera. The C buttons would be used to reorient the camera around Mario. You notice how the camera's moved with buttons? Yeah, it blows. It makes platforming a little bit more challenging, and the camera can sometimes get stuck in a wall. Later games like Sunshine and Galaxy fixed this issue by having the camera move around objects, with Mario only being seen with a shadow, making things a whole lot better. But like I said, it was ahead of the curve, and of course there was going to be kinks with it. But like I said, 64 is a wonderful game, and it knocked it out of the park first try, making every single 3D platformer released before this completely outdated right as soon as it dropped. The controls are top notch, and while other games definitely tweak the controls better, Except Sunshine, Mario 64 hits it out of the park with Mario's controls. Everything feels so snappy and responsive while giving Mario a long list of brand new moves to accommodate 3D platforming. And even if those later stages do get repetitive with its objectives, the level design hits it out of the park. Mario, you gotta stop, the team is 2 down, we're gonna have a mercy rule. It's not perfect level design, but they did a damn good job with it on their first try. They translated Mario's levels into 3D and it works. It just works. Obviously, they wouldn't get it perfect on their first try, but you gotta give it credit. These are wonderfully designed levels, especially in its time. So basically, Super Mario 64 clears any other 3D platformer, and it's actually the greatest thing of all time. Better than backup cameras, better than sliced bread, better than Super Mario All-Stars plus Super Mario World, better than Dr. Pepper. But 3 years later, after high anticipation, Sega finally did it. They released the 3D Sonic game people yearned for, and they knocked it out of the fucking park. You're not supposed to do that. Sonic Adventure gets a kind of a bad rep nowadays. Awkward dialogue with even awkwarder animation, glitches galore even if they aren't in the OG version, and on top of not being the best thing age-wise. So I wish people gave this game more slack. Sonic Adventure was way ahead of its time. Sonic Adventure looks like it came straight out of its era, but the game looks so goddamn good compared to the games released around its time. The lighting engine was absolutely ahead of its time, and any other re-release of this game never got close to the look this game had. To this very day, it's impressive that it's running on 25-year-old hardware, and the gameplay is still some of the best in 3D Sonic, and maybe Sonic as a whole. It is still, to this day, the closest attempt to classic Sonic gameplay in 3D, and on top of having still some of the best controlling Sonic gameplay in the entire series lineage. Some games like Frontiers got close, but no other Sonic game got close to the immaculate controls of SA1. I mean, SA2 is alright, but it's pretty much the same controls except for some fixes, like there's no spam dash and there's no shitty light speed dash. And the level design is phenomenal as well. Everything interconnects as much as the console could handle, and every place and location feels like an actual place and location you're visiting. The only game to do this exploration as good was Sonic Unleashed, with Frontiers kind of doing it best. Most Sonic games just feel like a bunch of obstacle courses interconnected by a storyline that fell flat. Even if the levels are well designed, none do a good job flowing like SA1 does. The closest is once again Sonic Unleashed, with Sonic Adventure 2 coming in a nice third place. Sonic Adventure 2 still the better game. And the abundance of characters you get to play as is insane for a game in 1999. Most of the characters suck ass, but they're pretty small parts of the game. Like Big the Cat story is an hour max. Big fucking whoop. But I'm not gonna sit here and glaze Sonic Adventure because it has like 20 trillion issues. Like the camera. I mean, it's better than 64's, but I mean, you just like took like a step forward. It's not that major. And like I said earlier, those other characters can be a chore to play. The only one that's actually fun besides Sonic is Tails, and that's because all you do is race Sonic in Sonic levels. But other than that, it is still one of the best Sonic games to this very day. It is the closest they ever got to translating those two classic 2D games into 3D, and honestly, I don't know why they went into such weird directions with the later games. I genuinely think if they kept this exact formula with Sonic and just expanded on it a little better, the dude would have had a better rep nowadays. But Big Sleeter, if Sonic Adventure is as good as it says, then why is the legacy of it being a poorly aged mess and Mario 64's legacy of being the greatest thing since sliced bread? Because unlike Nintendo, Sega can't fucking port anything. See, when people talk shit about Sonic Adventure, they're often talking about SADX, or a plethora of its ports. All of these ports are actually insanely, horribly inferior to the original. They have worse lighting, worse graphics, glitches that weren't even in the original, and tarnish the reputation of what was considered one of the greatest video games ever made. Sonic Adventure is a game that you need to play on OG hardware to see the vision with. I finally got this game on Dreamcast, and holy fuck, you understand why the initial reception was so high. The difference is night and day. Sonic Adventure's PC port's also a decent version of the game, but more or less because there are mods that overhaul everything to make it as close as to the original, also alongside widescreen. Playing this game with the original hardware and controller is one of the greatest video games I think I've ever played. It's like a completely different game compared to what people say. Mario 64 has its ports and remakes and whatever, but most of the time they're pretty faithful and none ruin the quality of the game. Though people will argue the version in 3D All-Stars is the worst version to play because it's the Shindu version, which adds rumble but removes the BLJ. Preposterous! So which one's better? I know there's people nowadays that come together to slander 64's name for being aged, but nothing in the same vein as Adventure. Both are aged in their own respective ways that were titans of their genre back in the day. One just happened to get the better half of the legacy. Both games have excellent controls, excellent gameplay, great level design, amazing replayability. Both soundtracks are insanely memorable and often considered the best video game soundtracks ever made. Adventure has points ahead of 64 for its playable characters, graphics, and the fucking Chow Garden, but 64 was preserved better. Adventure never had a good port to fall back on, and it ruined the entire game's reputation. And also, 100%ing 64 is actually the greatest form of replayability in the entire world, so there's that. But if we're gonna be comparing Mario and Sonic, let's compare their stats, alright? We're gonna play as Sonic, and we're gonna clear Mario in a race. I put money on this. I don't think I'm making rent this week.